fine. You can start the recording. Yep. Okay. So, what do we call it? Today, we'll be tackling the physiology portion of the autonomic nervous system. Inshallah, it'll be extremely easy. To my understanding, you guys just finished the anatomy session like maybe 30 minutes ago. So, inshallah, everything will be simple. So today, I'll just to briefly overview before I start. I'm gonna mostly rely on something different this time instead of going through the slides. I'll go through the slides at the end, but I think I want to focus on some of the main concepts first. So I'll be using mostly OneNote and writing, and then we'll move on to the slides after. So we'll quickly and briefly discuss the organization of the nervous system, the PNS, SNS, all of that, the receptors, the neurotransmitters, all that beautiful stuff. So we'll get through it in the following maybe hour, hopefully less. So yeah, if you do have any questions, just type them in the chat. I am keeping an eye on the chat, and you can stop me anytime. I don't mind re-explaining something like 10,000 times, so it's okay. And if you have any concerns or any problems, and if I'm unable to answer you, you can just email me later. And you can also send me a text on WhatsApp. I'll provide my phone number at the end as well. So yeah, let's get started. Salah, it'll be extremely easy. So first off, let's start with the organization of the, what do we call it? Of the nervous system. So as we know, the nervous system has a central portion. So it has a central portion over here, CNS, but we're not dealing with this at the moment. We're dealing with the peripheral nervous system. Now, as you know, you've been taking MSK for quite some time now. The peripheral nervous system has the somatic division and the autonomic division over here, autonomic. So we're mostly concerned over here in the autonomic division. This one you've been covering for like the past maybe 6 weeks through like muscular contraction, all of that. So you should already probably know this. As far as the autonomic nervous system is concerned, as we know, there are two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. We have the parasympathetic, and then we have the sympathetic. Now, the parasympathetic, as everyone knows, this division is responsible for something known as, all right, we're going to take it like very slowly and we're going to take it very basically. This is responsible for something known as rest and digest, or like more relaxed tones, rest and digest. As far as the sympathetic nervous system is concerned, it's more with the flight and fight response, as we all know. So keeping these two themes in mind, like these two general themes in mind for these two specific divisions of the nervous system, we can literally tackle everything in this lecture just based on these two things over here. So before I jump into something different, I just want to clarify that in the lecture, it mentions that there is a third division of the autonomic nervous system. It's known as the enteric nervous system. Enteric. This is technically part of the, like part of this and this, but it's kind of its own entity. So this thing, if like you'll take it again, and you don't have to focus on this right now. This is not just important, but just because it was mentioned in the lecture, this you'll cover it in the GI block. This has to do with the stomach and all of that. Basically, the stomach has its own set of neural networks that are independent. We don't really have to deal with this, but just know that it's technically, I guess, sort of part of the autonomic nervous system. At least that's what Dr. Abdul Jabbar classified it as. So now that we've covered this portion, now let's go to the functions. Now by function, we said that the parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for your rest and digest sort of thing, like rest and digest, while your sympathetic is for your fighting. So in that way, we can kind of see the functions derived from there. So we can tackle it by organ. For example, let's start by the GIT. I'm not going to like tackle every organ in the GI or whatever. I'm just going to go over things very briefly. So in the GIT, for example, we have in the parasympathetic nervous system, as we know, it is responsible for, well, resting and digesting. It's responsible for your relaxed response. So
can you
yeah.
go just over like what we took before, like at the end, if you don't mind, or like briefly what you just said, because I had problems in my network. I couldn't join earlier.
Sure, I'll do it later because I'm sort of a little bit into it, but I'll re-explain it in a bit, okay?
Okay. Thank
All
you.
right. So in the GIT, so again, the two divisions of the nervous system are the autonomic nervous system are the parasympathetic over here and the sympathetic. So for the GIT, let's tackle it organ by organ. So let's put like heart, it doesn't matter. Let's put heart, lungs, eyes, etc. It doesn't matter. So the general theme is you go back to these two things over here. Like think about it. When you're like stressed out and you want to do something very quickly, you activate your sympathetic nervous system. And when you are very, what do we call it, very relaxed and you're not worried about anything and you just eaten, you've just entered a food coma, like you just finished a very big meal, you enter your parasympathetic nervous system takes over. So in that case, let's think about it for a second. Now in the GIT, if the parasympathetic nervous system was active, we know that the GIT will be active. This is because we're trying to digest things. We're relaxed. We just ate a meal and we're trying to digest it. And therefore, the parasympathetic nervous system will work here. On the other hand, if you were stressed out, say you're running away from a lion or something, let's say there's a lion approaching you, like here, over here, your GIT doesn't really need to be active at the moment. I mean, you don't need your colon to be active when you're, what do we call it? When you're running away from a lion, because you don't really need it. That's why the sympathetic nervous system, in this case, would shut down the GIT. That's why it would inactivate it. In the case of the heart, your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system are responsible for the heart rate, or how fast the heart beats. So in case of the parasympathetic nervous system, when you're relaxed and doing nothing and just enjoying yourself, your heart rate is generally low. So low heart rate. So it slows down the heart, slows down. Now, when you're stressed out, say about an exam or the same lion is chasing you, your heart rate will start rising. And therefore your heart rate will rise, and therefore it speeds up the heart. Now, as far as lungs are concerned, let's think about it for a second. So in the lungs, what happens is that the lungs either open up or like the airway dilates or they close down. Now, generally, your lungs open up when you need more oxygen. And when do you need more oxygen? When you're using more oxygen. And when do you use more oxygen? When you're, say, running away from a lion again. So your lungs, during the sympathetic response, will dilate, or they will allow more air in. Allow air in. And the opposite is true for the parasympathetic nervous system. So just because in the sympathetic division, it dilates the airway, therefore we can understand in the parasympathetic division, it will constrict the airway. You don't need as much oxygen. You don't need as much oxygen, and that's why we don't need the airway to be open. As far as eyes are concerned, in this case, let's think about it. Again, when you're running away from, say, a lion, you want your eyes to be extremely active. The reason is you need to see the entire field. Like you need to see a lot of things happening. You need to keep track of a lot of things. So your eyes will open up, your pupils dilate to allow more light in. When light enters the eye itself, it means it can see more and it can navigate more, or it can navigate better. In the case of the parasympathetic nervous system, when you're relaxed, it just does the opposite. It constricts. And we can go on and so forth. So generally, in general, the functions of the sympathetic, oh dear, sent us to space. The functions of the sympathetic and parasympathetic are generally opposite to each other. They're generally opposite to each other. And sympathetic nervous system, for the sympathetic, it has to do with running away, being stressed out, trying to survive. Well, for the parasympathetic, it's like you're going on a vacation. You're trying to survive. You're trying to relax. So that's how you derive the function of both. There's no need to memorize any specific functions. Just think about it for a second. So that's generally the functions of these two. So now that we've got that out of the way, before that, actually, is there any question, any concerns, anything? It's okay, I can answer it. If not, we'll jump into the bulk of the lecture right now. All right, great. So, generally speaking, there is like a structural division of the what do we call it, of the sympathetic nervous system, and there's a what do we call it, there's a functional division. We just covered the functions. Now let's discuss the structure. So you guys just covered the anatomy just like about an hour ago, I think. So by structure, we know that the parasympathetic nervous system, so I drew over here a spinal cord. This is like a whole spinal cord over here. This is a spinal cord. Spinal cord. Generally speaking, if you remember from the anatomy lecture, I think it was covered in the anatomy lecture. By the way, this is either L2 or L3. Let me fix that. If you remember your anatomy lecture, you know that the parasympathetic nervous system gives off fibers from the spinal cord between T1 and L3 or L2. Or L2, depends on which source you're using. So whatever source you guys are, whatever is mentioned in the lecture, just follow that. Generally, these are where the sympathetic fibers go out. Now, these fibers, when they go out of the spinal cord, they will enter something known as the sympathetic chain. This is the sympathetic chain. This is generally speaking. This is generally for sympathetic nervous system. So it's between T1 and L2, L3, and it lands in the sympathetic chain. As far as the parasympathetic nervous system is concerned, it gives off fibers from 3 specific nerves in the brain. This keeps happening. So it gives off fibers, the parasympathetic fibers, from 3 different structures. I'll cover the details about the fibers in just a bit, but right now I'm just trying to give a general orientation. So it does it through cranial nerve number 3, which is known as the oculomotor nerve. Oculomotor. Cranial nerve number 7, which is known as the facial nerve. Cranial nerve number 9, which is the glossopharyngeal. By the way, in the lecture it wrote hypoglossal. That is wrong. The lecture slides are wrong. It is the glossopharyngeal, not the hypoglossal. And finally, there is the vagus. I'll show you the mistake in the slides in a bit when I go over them, but this is just to note this. You don't need to know these names, by the way. I don't think you need to cover them, as far as I know, based on my knowledge from first year. I don't think we had to memorize them back then, so you don't need to know these names, but just remember that the cranial nerves are 3, 7, that's not a 7, that's a 7, 9, and 10. These are the 4 cranial nerves. These are their numbers. Now, at the same time, there is also a bottom division of the parasympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic nervous system it's like sort of cut in two. So like it has this upper portion over here and it has this lower portion over here. This lower portion is known as the sacral region from S2 to S4. This is generally responsible for stuff like urination, what do we call it? Bowel movements, etc. So it has to do with the sphincters down there. So this is what these parasympathetic fibers are for. These are for like sort of the eyes and the tears and whatever. So they have to do more with your face and your internal organs, obviously through the vagus, but just to like sort of give it a general theme. Now, one thing I'd like to cover as well is that the vagus nerve over here, you see this thing, this guy is like the boss of them all. He's the boss. So this guy has about 75% of all sympathetic fibers, because this thing basically is a very big nerve. It goes off and it branches into a million different divisions. And yeah, basically most things come out of this nerve for the parasympathetic nervous system. Now that we've covered generally the general structure of everything, I want to start covering more specific details. So again, just to revise, the what do we call it? The autonomic nervous system is divided into 2 divisions, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. And they both like both of them come out of their respective portions on the spinal cord. So this is the spinal cord. Sympathetic fibers come out of here. Parasympathetic fibers come out of here. Cool. Now, let's jump more into the details. So we want to discuss their differences. Like, what is the difference between, say, the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system in the regards of like receptors, neurotransmitters, etc. So let's discuss over here. So suppose these are, okay, if this could work and it stops shifting me, it'll make my life very easy. All right, suppose that these are neurons. So this is a neuron. Yep, I think there's something in the chat. No. Carnival are part of the parasympathetic. So I don't think you need to know the cranial nerves. By the way, they're cranial nerves, not carnival nerves. What do we call it? You don't need to know them as far as I know, but their names are written in the lecture. So just remember their numbers at least. At least just know the numbers 3, 7, 9, 10. 3, 7, 9, 10. These are like they give off parasympathetic. Parasympathetic. Okay. Something in the chat. Yeah, no worries. Okay. All right. So let's discuss the division of like the differences between the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic. Okay. All right. So before we do this, I want to quickly define something, just very quickly. Now, in the lecture, it mentioned something known as, like the first slide, I think Dr. Abdul-Jabbar wrote a question, just like cholinergic, adrenergic, whatever. So let's quickly define those very quickly. So cholinergic has to do with neurotransmitter acetylcholine. So acetylcholine. So the word cholinergic comes from the word choline. So anything that is cholinergic uses this neurotransmitter. That's it. As far as adrenergic is concerned, it has the exact same thing, but it has to do with norepinephrine and epinephrine. So this is the only difference. So they're basically neurons that use norepinephrine and epinephrine. Cholinergic are neurons that use acetylcholine. This is the only difference between these two. Obviously, they have big differences between them, but this is like the difference in terminology. And all right, so now that we've defined those two things, let's discuss the division in terms of, the differences between their structure not structure, in terms of function. So generally speaking, this is the parasympathetic over here on the top, these two neurons down here. And this is the sympathetic. Okay, so let's discuss the differences between both of these. So first off, as you notice, actually before differences, let's discuss the similarities. Now, as we know, the parasympathetic system and the sympathetic system, or the autonomic system, consists of two sets of neurons, something known as the pre-ganglionic neuron and a post-ganglionic neuron. Same thing over here, pre-ganglionic, and this is post-ganglionic. Now, if you remember from like the anatomy lecture, these are ganglions. All right. I don't like this app. All right, these are the ganglia. So ganglia, if you remember, I think from foundation or anything, they're collections of cell bodies of neurons, cell bodies of neurons. So what happens is that there's a neuron from the spinal cord over here. Say we start over here at T1. There's one neuron in here. It goes all the way in and then it synapses over here. So it connects over here. This is known as the preganglionic neuron, preganglionic. The reason it's called preganglionic is because this is the ganglion. It comes before the ganglion. Now, in the ganglion itself, like over here, like this collection of cell bodies, what happens is that there's another neuron that arises here. Now, this neuron will give off branches that go all the way to the organ. So say this is the organ over here, organ. So this neuron starts from the ganglion and ends all the way at the organ. This is known as the postganglionic neuron. It's postganglionic because it comes after the ganglion. That's it. That's the only difference between these two. So the autonomic nervous system consists of two sets of neurons, pre and post ganglionic. Cool. Now we can go back to the thing we were discussing earlier. So now that we've identified the pre and post ganglionic neurons over here, let me check anything in the chat. No. Now that we've identified these two sets of neurons, we can discuss the differences between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. So as far as the parasympathetic system, we can notice that the preganglionic neuron is much longer than the postganglionic neuron. Notice how tall this neuron, or sorry, how long this neuron is, and notice how short this neuron is. This means that if we go back to this diagram over here, it's a bit messy right now. Let me clear it up very quickly. Let me just delete everything. There we go. You can watch the recording again if you want to take notes for this. So I think we'll be okay. Let's see. So we said for the parasympathetic, again, just to repeat, for the parasympathetic, say we start somewhere over here, up here. This is the preganglionic neuron because it starts from the central nervous system, from the spinal cord. And then it goes out, it's very long, and it synapses somewhere over here. This is a ganglion. Now, the thing about this ganglion is, unlike the sympathetic chain, it's very far away from the spinal cord. This is the spinal cord. It's super far away from the spinal cord. That means that the ganglion in the parasympathetic nervous system is much closer to the organ that it's supposed to act on. So say this is the, let's just say, for example, this is the heart. The ganglion over here for the parasympathetic division is much closer to the heart than the ganglion, say this ganglion for the sympathetic nervous system, say, let's just say this one. This one is the one that controls the heart. This one is very far from the heart. If you notice, this is the distance. So generally speaking, for the parasympathetic, the ganglion is closer to the organ. Cool. This means that the neuron has to travel much more to reach the ganglion, and that's why it's much longer. As far as the postganglionic neuron over here, it just has to travel a very short distance and it'll reach the heart. So there's always two neurons. It's just the distance between the first one and the second one. Now, if we go back over here very quickly, we also notice something else. We can notice that these neurons over here, these preganglionic neurons, use something known as acetylcholine. So if you zoom in over here, this is the synapse. When they release the neurotransmitters over here, these neurotransmitters are, if my thing could load, oh dear. These neurotransmitters are acetylcholine. And now I'm stuck. 1 second. My device got stuck. Okay. Acetylcholine. So these neurotransmitters are acetylcholine. So this is what?
Cholinergic.
Yeah. This is cholinergic, but this is what the neurons use. So yeah, any questions? Someone open their mic? No? Okay. All right, so let's go back to the diagram over here. So we mentioned that this preganglionic neuron is cholinergic. Okay, can you? I apologize for this. This app sometimes is broken, so it shifts back like this. Anyways, I think it'll shift me back again. Yeah, of course. Just give me a moment. Anyways, the postganglionic neuron over here, if you notice the small one. Okay. All right, not cool. 1 second, let me sort this out. For some reason, this is glitching out on me right now. All right, I think I sorted it. Yeah, I did. All right, so if you notice over here, yeah, someone, can you have a prayer break? Yes, that is okay. Do you guys want a prayer break right now? Should I finish the concept and give you guys a prayer break right after? Okay, so I'll just quickly finish this parasympathetic division and we'll stop for like 10 minutes maybe. Is that cool? Okay. All right, so just to quickly finish here. Just to quickly finish, we said that the preganglionic neuron is cholinergic. This means it uses acetylcholine. Now, if you notice, I drew the other neuron in blue as well. Well, I covered it in yellow, but it's supposed to be blue over here. In the parasympathetic division, the postganglionic neuron, postganglionic, is also cholinergic. That's also cholinergic. This means that it also uses acetylcholine. So it'll release here again, acetylcholine, and this acts on the organ. For example, causes the stomach to digest more. Same thing for the heart over here. The preganglionic. Okay, all right, now cool. The preganglionic releases acetylcholine over here. Well, too bad. Well, the same concept again. Acetylcholine is released over here. It can go all the way over here. And this causes, what do we call it? The parasympathetic stimulation of the heart, which, as we mentioned, decreases the heart rate from earlier. So this is generally the concept of the two neurons in the parasympathetic division. Now I'll finish off the sympathetic division right after the prayer. Are all parasympathetic neurons cholinergic and sympathetic adrenergic? No, actually, I'll cover that right after. So if you guys want a prayer break, we'll stop right now. Can you pause the recording? Let's start. Try to finish quickly. So just to quickly recap what we were doing, we were comparing the differences between the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system on a very small scale, just to see the differences between these two things on a physiological basis. So, as we mentioned earlier, in the parasympathetic nervous system, we have two sets of neurons. We have the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron. Now, what's special about the parasympathetic nervous system is that the preganglionic neuron is cholinergic. It's cholinergic, meaning it uses acetylcholine, and the postganglionic neuron is also cholinergic, and it also uses acetylcholine. Now we'll discuss the differences between these two neurons a bit later. They have to do with the receptor that acetylcholine binds to. So acetylcholine, once it's released from this neuron over here, it binds to a receptor on the next neuron or the next organ. Now, depending on what that receptor is, it'll dictate its function. So we'll discuss that in just a minute. Now, let's roll back a little bit and discuss the sympathetic nervous system here for a second. So in the sympathetic nervous system, it's not much different. So as we can see, it's, well, two neurons as well. Two neurons, two sets of neurons. More accurately like this, it's two neurons, like right here. The chain is two neurons. The first neuron, which is very interesting, is cholinergic. It's cholinergic. It's not adrenergic. It is cholinergic, meaning it uses acetylcholine. The first neuron is identical to this neuron. It's the same neuron. So anything coming out of the spinal cord is cholinergic. I'll discuss that in a bit. I don't know your name, it's just an ID, but I'll discuss the difference between nicotinic and muscarinic in a bit. So I just want to discuss the different neurons right now. So the neuron in the sympathetic chain over here, when it reaches the sympathetic chain, so over here is the sympathetic chain, this is the sympathetic chain, it reached it. Over here, the preganglionic neuron is cholinergic, very important to remember. And the postganglionic neuron is what makes the difference between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. This neuron is adrenergic, if I can spell here. So adrenergic, meaning it uses norepinephrine as the neurotransmitter. So if we zoom in over here, this is norepinephrine. This is norepinephrine. So this norepinephrine binds to a receptor on the stomach. And in this case, it'll decrease the activity because we don't need the stomach to work when the sympathetic nervous system is active. And in the case of the heart, it increases its activity and causes an increase in heart rate. This is just a general example. You don't have to memorize these. These are just examples for the sake of understanding. So let's quickly summarize the differences between these two systems in terms of these neurons. So let's put them over here for a second. So in the parasympathetic nervous system, I'm going to use blue here just to stay consistent. In the parasympathetic nervous system, we know that the preganglionic neuron is long and cholinergic. The postganglionic neuron is short and also cholinergic. So in the parasympathetic nervous system, the main neurotransmitter that is used is acetylcholine. Now, to compare it with the sympathetic nervous system, so to write it down over here in the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic, just to stay consistent again, the preganglionic is short. It's the exact opposite, but it's cholinergic. It's still cholinergic. That means it uses acetylcholine. The difference lies in the postganglionic neuron after it leaves the sympathetic chain. Postganglionic. This neuron is long and adrenergic, meaning it uses norepinephrine. Cool. So this is the differences between these two neurons. So now that we've discussed these specific differences, we can jump into more specific things. Now, I just want to point out some exceptions over here. So the first thing I want to discuss before I jump into the different receptors and whatever, I just want to mention that the adrenal gland, what do you want me to repeat? Siham? What do you want me to repeat? Yeah, okay. So basically, okay, just to start off again, I'll summarize it very quickly for you. So in the spinal cord, we start over here. Let's start over here again. In the spinal cord, we have a neuron coming out over here. It goes here. It may go into the sympathetic chain, which you took from the anatomy. So it's this thing over here, collection of ganglia. This is the first neuron. The reason it's called preganglionic is because it's before the ganglia. And then after it leaves like this, it becomes the postganglionic and it goes to an organ. Now, in the autonomic nervous system, we don't just have sympathetic only or parasympathetic only. There's two sets. There's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Now, the difference between these two lies in the neurons themselves. So what makes them different? So what's the difference between these two neurons, these two sets of neurons per se? So let's erase everything again. Okay. There's something in the chat. It's not like there's no significance to one being longer and one being shorter. It's just the anatomy, how it works. So basically during development and embryology, the sympathetic chain is just closer to the spinal cord, which is why it's short on the preganglionic and why it needs to travel more to reach the organ. That's why this is long. On the other hand, the parasympathetic, the ganglia starts very close to the organ. That means that the Preganglionic is long and the postganglionic is short. There's no significant to it other than that, honestly. It's just nothing significant there. It's just a difference to ask you about. Yeah, cool. You're welcome. All right, again, let's discuss the differences here. So here, in the parasympathetic, we have two sets of neurons. We said one that reaches the ganglion, this is the ganglion, and one that leaves the ganglion, and this is the postganglionic neuron. In the parasympathetic, you just have to memorize this. This neuron is cholinergic. It's cholinergic, meaning it releases acetylcholine. Like once the signal travels all the way down the neuron, it'll release acetylcholine. The second neuron in the parasympathetic also releases acetylcholine. It's a cholinergic neuron. So this second neuron over here, it's kind of messy over here. Let's look at the one down there. The other one is also cholinergic. This is cholinergic, meaning it releases acetylcholine. So in parasympathetic nervous system, in the parasympathetic nervous system, both neurons, the pre and the postganglionic, are cholinergic. They just use acetylcholine. That's it. In the sympathetic nervous system, the difference is the first neuron is the same. This is the same as this. These two neurons are identical. One is just longer, the other is shorter. They both are cholinergic. This is cholinergic. Cholinergic. The difference lies in the second neuron, which is adrenergic. Adrenergic. Adrenergic, meaning it releases norepinephrine. So it uses this. Now, if you know, like just think about it in general. When you use your sympathetic nervous system, when you see a lion, you hear about, what do we call it? Your adrenaline goes up. Your adrenaline goes up. Adrenaline is just epinephrine. So just to remember, just so you can remember, imagine you're stressed out about something or running away from something. Remember, adrenergic is epinephrine, and epinephrine and norepinephrine do almost the exact same thing. These two neurotransmitters are almost like they're very similar to each other. So they do the exact same thing almost. So that's just a quick way to remember it there. So in the sympathetic nervous system, there's two neurons. One is cholinergic, meaning it uses acetylcholine. That's the first one, the preganglionic one. And the second one is adrenergic, meaning it uses norepinephrine. Is that clear? Do you want me to repeat that? Okay. All right. If you do have any confusion about it, Siham, you can just message me at the end and I'll clear it up to you for a specific question. Someone asked, parasympathetic is close to the organ? Yes, it is. So the parasympathetic, the ganglion itself over here, is closer to the organ. That's it. It's just anatomical. There's like nothing else to know. Just memorize it. Parasympathetic ganglia are generally speaking closer to the organ. All right. In para, they're both cholinergic, and sympathetic versus cholinergic. Yes, that's true. That's it. That's literally it. That's all you need to remember about this. And the associated neurotransmitters. Cholinergic is acetylcholine. Adrenergic is norepinephrine. That's it. Now, I just want to quickly discuss a very small point that was mentioned in the lecture. There was an exception over here. So in the adrenal gland itself, in the sympathetic portion, this is the sympathetic portion. The parasympathetic portion is normal, like it functions the exact same way. First one is cholinergic, the second one is cholinergic as well. So this is neuron over here. This is cholinergic, choli, and the second one is also cholinergic. Cool. This is for the parasympathetic. Now I'm specifically talking about the sympathetic here. In the adrenal gland, instead of the neuron, this neuron over here, this cholinergic neuron, this is a cholinergic neuron. You remember the sympathetic, the first one is cholinergic. Instead of going to the sympathetic chain, it goes directly to the adrenal gland. So this is the adrenal gland. This is the adrenal gland. So it doesn't drop by a ganglion. You know what acts as a ganglion? This gland itself. This is acting like a ganglion. It's acting like a ganglion. So the first neuron over here is cholinergic, as we mentioned. It releases, well, acetylcholine. Now, what happens is this acetylcholine enters this adrenal gland. Now, if we zoom in into the adrenal gland, we can see a cell over here. This cell over here. This is known as a chromaffin cell. Just memorize the name. You'll take this in endorepro in second year again, but just to briefly cover, this is a chromaffin cell. This cell, when remember it has receptors over here. Acetylcholine will come bind onto here, which was released from the neuron over here. So it came all the way from there. It bound to this cell. Now what this cell does, it just releases epinephrine. That's it. It releases epinephrine into the bloodstream. It's almost the same where this specific cell, this chromaffin cell, is acting like an adrenergic neuron. Isn't that right? So in the adrenergic pathway, we said, or the sympathetic pathway, the first one is cholinergic. So the first one is cholinergic. And the second one is adrenergic. This is in the sympathetic pathway. The same thing happens in the adrenal gland. The only difference is it's the cell that does it this time instead of the actual neuron. So instead of this being a neuron, it's just a cell. That's it. It's a chromaffin cell.
So basically, this adrenal gland, I think it releases acetylcholine, and then the cell gets the acetylcholine and releases releases adrenaline, I guess. I think I said it wrong. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, adrenaline or epinephrine. Same thing. Epinephrine is the same as adrenaline. Epinephrine is equal to adrenaline. So it's basically just acting like a postganglionic neuron, but it's just a cell. That's the only difference. Epinephrine or adrenaline. So yeah, is this concept clear? I can re-clear it up again. It's okay. Does everyone get it for the adrenal gland? It's literally just the same. The only difference is this is a cell and it's not a neuron. That's it. BV is a blood vessel. So this is a blood vessel. Blood vessel. Nope. Blood vessel. There we go. So the adrenal gland, both acetylcholine and epinephrine are released. No. So the adrenal gland, it receives acetylcholine, and releases epinephrine. So it receives this and dumps this. So once it gets this, it releases this. It's not like it releases both. Got it? Okay. Cool. I'll quickly repeat it again since someone asked. Again, remember in the sympathetic, there's two neurons like this, one like this, one like this. This one is cholinergic. The other one is adrenergic. This is what we talked about. The only difference in the adrenal gland is that there's a neuron over here. It's cholinergic. It goes to this cell over here, this cell over here, which is the chromaffin cell or the adrenal gland cell. And this cell just releases, what do we call it? It releases epinephrine, which is adrenergic. So this is adrenergic. It's the same thing, except this is a cell. That's it. And it releases epinephrine, a hormone. Yeah. Yeah, this is why it's stimulated in the fight or flight response. Just excuse me, guys, for 1 second. I need to open the door. Okay, guys, sorry about that. I'm back. Chromaffin is the cell. It's just the name of the cell. It's just a cell in the adrenal gland. You don't have to memorize the name as far as I know. It's just the name of the cell. Instead of this being neuron, this is just known as chromaffin cell. That's it. Okay, cool. Just a quick fun fact, I guess. You don't have to know this. You don't have to ask about it. It's okay. Chromaffin cell is basically a neuron. It is basically the same thing as a neuron. It's just a neuron without the axon. It's just missing an axon. This is why it's a cell. It forgot its axon. So yeah, this is a small fun fact. Anyways, so we've discussed the adrenal gland, we've discussed all of this stuff, the two pathways and whatever. Now we can jump into something different. Let's talk about the receptors now. So we've been talking about the two neurons, we've been talking about the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Let's discuss the receptors now. So just to recall ourselves, so we can remember, in the sympathetic pathway, in the parasympathetic pathway, we have two neurons, one that is long over here and one that is short over here. Cool. And then in the sympathetic, same thing, two neurons, one that is short and the other one is long, like this. This again, this is sympathetic, this is parasympathetic over here. It's the other way around, my bad. Parasympathetic. Okay. So let's talk about the receptors. Now, we said that these two things over here, these two neurons in both pathways, in the parasympathetic and sympathetic, they're cholinergic, meaning they use acetylcholine. Acetylcholine. Now, what's interesting is that if you zoom in over here onto the synapse, they have receptors over here, like over here and over here. This acetylcholine, so say this is acetylcholine, it'll bind to this receptor over here, same thing, acetylcholine. Now, what makes our life easier is that this receptor is identical in both pathways. It is known as the nicotinic receptor. Nicotinic receptor. And it binds acetylcholine. This is, I think, different. This is different from the, what do we call it? No, actually, I think it's the same as the nicotinic receptor from the neuromuscular junction. It also binds nicotine. It binds acetylcholine. And the only difference, these are in the postsynaptic neurons over here, if you see. So this acetylcholine from both pathways binds to the nicotinic receptor over here. Now, the differences, so again, as we mentioned earlier, the neurons are the same. They're both cholinergic and they both bind to the exact same receptor in both pathways. Now, the differences lies in the second one over here. So organ and organ. Now, in case of the parasympathetic nervous system, we said that the postganglionic neuron is cholinergic. The neuron that comes after the ganglion is cholinergic, meaning it also releases acetylcholine. Acetylcholine. Now, this acetylcholine, in this case, in the parasympathetic nervous system, binds to these receptors over here. These are known as muscarinic receptors. Muscarinic receptors. So, in the parasympathetic pathway, the receptors that are at the organ level after the postganglionic neuron are muscarinic. All of them. All of them are muscarinic. In the heart, in the brain, in the whatever organ, internal organ you can think of, they all have muscarinic receptors. Now, obviously, the way they function differently is that they have subtypes. Each receptor has a subtype. We're not going to discuss that. You'll discuss it later in second year. So right now, all you need to know is that they all end in muscarinic receptors. Now, we can discuss the sympathetic pathway. I think that's clear. Does anyone have questions about the parasympathetic muscarinic thing?
I just want to ask a question. The nicotinic receptor is basically at the neuronic neurons or like postganglionic neurons?
Yeah, it's on the postganglionic neuron on the cell body. So on the cell body of postganglionic neuron. Okay.
Is it the sympathetic or the parasympathetic that has the muscarinic on the organ?
Parasympathetic.
So parasympathetic is the thing that the first neuron is cholinergic and then the second neuron is adrenergic?
No, the second neuron is also cholinergic. In parasympathetic, both are cholinergic. Para means both cholinergic. Cholinergic.
Okay.
In the sympathetic, the first one is cholinergic. The second one is adrenergic. Choli
Okay.
followed by adre.
And then, so there's both nicotinic and muscarinic receptors in the parasympathetic neurons.
Yeah. Yeah. So in the first one, it's nicotonic over here. This is nicotonic. The first one is nicotonic over here. The second one is muscarinic. Okay.
Why are they different? Since if they both are receptors for ACH.
It's just the way they function. So
Is it
basically,
one because it's in muscles and the other one is because it's in the neurons? That's why they're called. For an example, this one is called muscarinic, basically because it's in the smooth muscles.
not necessarily smooth muscles, but yeah.
But like
it's
muscles
basically
in general.
it's not about muscles. It's about like it's just like event. Yeah, at the beginning it was about smooth muscles, but then they found out it wasn't, etc., etc. Basically, the difference is because the receptor is different. You remember how you learned about receptors, some of them being voltage gated voltage gated sodium channels, like sodium channels, and some receptors are ligand receptors for like G protein, One of them is like for G protein, the other one is for like a voltage gated channel. This is why they're like slightly different. So they do different actions. That's why.
What's the receptor on the organ for sympathetics?
I'll get into it right now. Let's see, sympathetic and parasympathetic the same. So in the first neuron, yes, they are the same. These are identical neurons. They do the exact same thing. They bind to the exact same receptor with the exact same neurotransmitter, which is acetylcholine. Acetylcholine will come here, bind to the nicotonic receptor again. This is the same. Nicotonic. They both have the same thing.
I have a doubt about the epinephrine.
Sorry?
I have a doubt about the epinephrine.
The epinephrine? Like for...
Yeah, so epinephrine is a neurotransmitter, right? Which is released by adrenal gland also.
It's technically a neurotransmitter in some neurons, but it's actually a hormone. Like it goes into the bloodstream. So it circulates around. That's why it's like it goes to the adrenal gland. This is like kind of beyond the level of the lecture, but yeah, there you go.
Also, doesn't okay, so you said that the adrenergic neurons secrete norepinephrine and epinephrine, right? So doesn't epinephrine do kind of like the heartbeat stimulation, all the fight or flight response thing?
Yep.
While norepinephrine kind of counters that and like calms it down. So how is norepinephrine in the sympathetic neurons rather than the parasympathetic neurons?
Okay, so let me clear this misconception. Norepinephrine and epinephrine do almost the exact same thing. They're not opposite to each other. These are similar to each other. They're not opposite. These are not opposite. These are very similar. So this just looks like this. For example, when we talk about, say there's a brother and sister, the brother and sister look slightly different, but for example, they come from the same family. So they do almost the exact same thing. It's a bad comparison, but you get the point there. Nor doesn't mean no in this case. It's just the way the what do we call it? The compound looks like. So they do almost the exact same thing with some slight differences.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Okay, so we've discussed for the parasympathetic pathway. Now we mentioned in the sympathetic pathway, it's acetylcholine, binds to the nicotonic receptor, does yada, yada, yada. It goes into this neuron. Now this neuron is what's different for the sympathetic. In the sympathetic, most neurons, if not like 99% of neurons, release norepinephrine. So this norepinephrine over here, this is norepinephrine. It goes and binds to receptors. These receptors are of two types. They could be alpha receptors or beta receptors. So depending on the organ, so whatever this organ is, say it's the heart. In the heart, this receptor is, what do we call it? An alpha receptor. sorry, a beta receptor. It's just a technicality. In, say, the blood vessel, it's an alpha receptor, and they do different things. This receptor does something different as this, but depending on the organ, it might have either alpha or beta. Is that clear so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So this norepinephrine will bind either to alpha or beta receptors. Once they are bound to these receptors, 1 second, guys. Just give me a second, guys. There's something going on over here. All right, sorry about that. I'm back. Basically, it's just these two receptors. Norepinephrine binds to these two different receptors. We'll discuss their properties in just a second right now. We'll discuss them in just a minute. So it's just these two receptors. Just remember alpha and beta receptors. Ella, we'll go down over here and we'll discuss them. So in, again, the sympathetic nervous system, let's start from the diagram over here. So the neurons, we said for the sympathetic pathway, they come out from the CNS or the spinal cord as the preganglionic neuron. And this neuron uses nicotinic receptors. The same thing over here, nicotinic receptors. These use acetylcholine and they stimulate the second neuron, which is adrenergic in this case, or sympathetic. This is adrenergic. Adrenergic. In this case, over here on the other side, it's still cholinergic. This is still cholinergic, and it binds to muscarinic receptors, as we mentioned. As far as the sympathetic nervous system, we said that the norepinephrine release can either bind to an alpha receptor or a beta receptor. Now, the difference between them is the action. I'll discuss the action for each one in just a second. Now, a general rule of thumb, if you remember G proteins and all of that, I'll just quickly summarize it. These all have elevation of cyclic AMP. If you remember what that is, cyclic AMP uses cyclic AMP. All beta receptors use cyclic AMP, like the G protein thing. Remember where cyclic AMP goes up?
Remind me what is CMP?
Yeah, so it's basically the G protein, the receptor binds to it. Cyclic AMP is the result of like the adenylyl cyclase and allelyl cyclase cleaving ATP. And then cyclic AMP is produced, which is a secondary messenger. You don't need to know much more than that. Just remember that it's related to cyclic AMP secondary messenger, if you remember that from foundation or from any of the physiology lectures. Just remember it's related to cyclic AMP. Any beta receptor has to do with cyclic AMP elevation. Cyclic AMP. In terms of alpha, this receptor has to do with the IP3 pathway. If you remember the IP3, calcium, whatever, calcium, secondary messenger, that stuff. You don't need to remember the details, but just remember that pathway. And alpha 2 is kind of special. We'll discuss it in just a minute. So these are the general differences between alpha and beta receptors. So beta have to do with cyclic AMP going up. Alpha 1 has to do with calcium and IP3 going up. These are just secondary messengers. They like signal things. And I will discuss what they'll signal in just a second. So over here, I have some diagrams down here. I have some diagrams. So in the sympathetic pathway, you're going to cover this again in cardio, by the way, but just so I can correlate it for you guys, because Dr. Abdul Jabbar included the functions of each one of these receptors in a slide. So I'm just going to quickly summarize it for you. So under sympathetic stimulation, again, so sympathetic nervous system is active. We said that releases norepinephrine from the second neuron. This norepinephrine comes over here and binds to a receptor. This receptor is, let's just say, alpha 1 receptor. Now, just a general rule of thumb, alpha 1 is found in blood vessels. Remember that alpha 1 is mainly found in blood vessels. What this does it comes in, binds to the receptor over here, and causes the blood vessel to constrict, basically shrink in size. Like the hole inside of it becomes smaller. You don't need to remember this function. Just remember that alpha 1 causes constriction of blood vessels. Constriction of blood vessel. This is just to correlate it. Alpha 1 stimulation causes constriction of blood vessels. Alpha 2, we said it's kind of special. Now, if you remember, there's like this whole thing over here. If you remember, neurotransmitters are released from a vacuole. They get dumped into the synapse, and then they act on here. Say this is the alpha 1 receptor from earlier. This is then, again, this is still sympathetic. This is still sympathetic. This thing gets dumped into the synapse, and it binds over here. But at the same time, some of them might bind over here on the alpha 2 receptor. Alpha 2 receptor, all it does is limit how much neurotransmitter is being released. So it inhibits the release of neurotransmitters here. That's it.
So the alpha 2 is on the neuron itself and not on the organ?
Yep. Alpha 2 are almost exclusively found on the neuron itself.
Can you repeat this diagram for real quick?
Sorry?
Can you repeat the diagram real quick?
Okay, so this diagram, all it's showing is the cell over here. Say this is a smooth muscle cell, smooth muscle. And say this is the sympathetic nervous system. So remember the second neuron, postganglionic neuron, postganglionic, that's adrenergic. This thing releases norepinephrine. So this over here, these small particles are norepinephrine. So these norepinephrine will do their thing. They'll go bind to the alpha 1 receptor, and they do their thing over here. Whatever they do to this smooth muscle, they do it. What happens is, yeah, I guess so. Alpha 2 technically monitors how much alpha 1 is released. How much norepinephrine is released. So basically all that happens is some of these neurotransmitters will go back over here and bind to the alpha 2 receptor. All this guy does is inhibitory. It is inhibitory. It prevents excess release of norepinephrine. It's basically like a brake. It's like brakes, you know, when you brake your car, it's very similar to that. So it's an inhibitory receptor. It's found on neuron. Yeah.
Is it just norepinephrine or epinephrine too?
Epinephrine can bind here, but it's usually norepinephrine. Like if the neuron uses epinephrine, that can also happen there. All right, so that's it for alpha receptors. Just remember their two functions and their location. Alpha 1 is usually in blood vessels. Alpha 2 is on neurons. Now, let's quickly discuss the beta. They're very easy, very simple. They do almost all of them do the exact same thing. They're just different receptors found in different locations. The reason this is called beta 1 and this is called beta 2 and this is called beta 3 is because they're slightly different and they're found in different organs. So each one is in a different organ. So I'll recap it at the end. So beta 1 is found on the heart. What it does is that epinephrine or norepinephrine will come, bind to this beta 1 receptor, and then you know what the sympathetic nervous system does to the heart? It increases the heart rate. It makes your heart go faster. This is how this works. Increases heart rate. This is for beta 1. That's it. So beta 1 through epinephrine and norepinephrine through the sympathetic pathway from the sympathetic part, it releases norepinephrine or epinephrine on the beta 1 receptor, and that causes the heart rate to go faster. And you'll cover this more in CVP next semester. For the lungs, it's beta 2 receptor. Generally, the lungs have beta 2 receptors. Beta 2 receptors, in this case, are on the airway over here. So say this is over here. This is the beta 2 receptor, beta 2. What happens is the exact same thing. Epinephrine or norepinephrine, or they bind to this receptor. And what this causes is dilation of the airway. The reason is because you need more oxygen when you're in the flight or fight response. You need more oxygen because you need more ATP. If you remember that, oxygen leads to the formation of ATP. That's why the airway dilates, to allow more oxygen in there. Finally, the final receptor we have is beta 3. For beta 3, it's not very significant, Okay. It's rarely found in the body, but it is found in adipocytes or fat cells. All it does is when you're running away from, like, say, for example, when your sympathetic nervous system is active, you're running away from a lion, you need energy. This beta 3 receptor causes this fat to break down and be released into the system. So you can use it as energy into the system. It causes something known as lipolysis. You don't need to know the details of this. Lipo, in this case, lipo means fat. Lysis means breakdown. So breakdown of fat. So it causes the fat breakdown. It's released into the system because your system is in fight or flight response. So like your stress, adrenaline is high. You're running away from something, fight and flight. You need energy, and this energy comes from these beta 3 receptors. So just to recap again, just to quickly recap, beta 1 is found on the heart. Beta 2 is generally found on the lung. Beta 3 is generally found on fat cells. Obviously, these are not the only places where the receptors are found, but these are the main sites of these receptors. So yeah, are there any questions here? Do you want me to repeat anything? I'll quickly go through the slides as well, so you can cover that as well. Any problems over here? Nicotonic is it's just the name of the receptor over here. Like, oh, let's just say this one over here. So you remember this receptor from, like, remember the preganglionic neuron over here binding to the postganglionic neuron over here? It uses the nicotonic receptor. The reason it's called nicotonic, by the way, is because nicotine binds over here. This is just fun fact. You don't need to know this. Nicotine can bind on this receptor. And this is why, like, there's addiction happening and whatever on both sides of the, what do we call it, on both sides over here? Because you don't need to know this.
Isn't it ACH binding over there?
Yeah. Usually it's ACH, usually. I'm sorry for the confusion. It's usually ACH, but when you smoke or whatever, nicotine can bind as well. Like, two things can bind on the same receptor. Nicotine looks like acetylcholine. That's why it can bind there. But you don't need to know this. This is way beyond your level. But it's just a fun fact as to why it was called the nicotonic receptor.
All right, so both.
That's it.
All right, so both nicotonic and muscarinic both take ACH, right?
Yep, they both take ACH.
All right, and even alpha 2 is a receptor?
Alpha 2 is epinephrine.
Yeah, so is it a receptor?
It is a receptor.
Okay.
Yep.
Can you explain how is it a receptor? Because it controls, right? It doesn't receive anything.
No, it does receive. It receives norepinephrine. It's like a break. So like norepinephrine is being used here and here at the same time. This just prevents over release of norepinephrine. So it's like a slight controller. That's it.
All right, thank you.
It's like, you're welcome.
Also, where is alpha 1 exactly? Yeah. Like you said, beta 1 is in the heart. So where is alpha 1?
Yeah. Alpha 1 is in blood vessels, usually.
Okay,
blood vessels. Yeah. Blood vessels.
What does bind to alpha 2? Like in alpha 1, it binds to the NE, but what binds to alpha 2? Same thing?
Same thing, norepinephrine and epinephrine, same thing.
Okay. So, sorry for bothering you. So, like some epinephrine gets released or neuroepinephrine gets released, they go to the cell, muscle cell, and like those released norepinephrine, basically they go to the alpha 2 so that they can close it or inhibit the release of another NA, right?
Yeah, basically, it's just limits how much is released.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so I think that's mostly it. I just want to cover one last concept over here quickly, which is Horner syndrome. Horner syndrome, all that happens is, like in the lecture, I think it was mentioned, it was either the disruption of something known as the stellate ganglion, or a problem in the chain itself, the sympathetic chain, the cervical chain. What happens is, like, let's think about it for a second. Okay, it's just glitching on me again now. All right, can't have good things. Let's see. All right, so over here, let's think about it. In Horner syndrome, it's just the name of the guy who discovered it. In Horner syndrome, what happens is the sympathetic chain is cut. It's cut, it's destroyed, it's completely gone. This is what happens. So what happens is, once this sympathetic chain is gone, usually what happens is, if you remember what the sympathetic does to the eye, we mentioned earlier that sympathetic causes dilation of the eye. The reason is when you run away from a lion, as we mentioned, you need to see more and your eyes need to dilate more. So they need to be more open. Your pupil needs to be more open. Now, what happens when you cut this sympathetic chain? It's just the parasympathetic takes over. So there's increased parasympathetic activity. Usually they're in balance. So usually sympathetic and parasympathetic are equal to each other. They're usually equal. What happens is if you cut this out, this becomes more. When this becomes more, this causes the constriction of the pupil, because you don't, if you remember, the parasympathetic is for relaxing. You don't need to see as much. So it constricts the pupil. But in this case, it can't be dilated because you cut the sympathetic chain. It's gone. It's gone forever. This is why the pupil is constricted. What also happens is that there is drooping of the eyelid, or basically, see the difference between these two. The eyelid over here is very open. It's way back over here. The eyelid over here is like sort of downward. This is not controlled by the patient. It's just how it is. The reason is the sympathetic chain also controls this muscle over here. You see this muscle over here? This one, the one I highlighted, this is also controlled by the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, this specific muscle. So what happens is if you cut this out, this becomes drooped. That's it. No. Only one eye constricts because there you have two chains. You have one chain on the right, one chain on the left. If you cut the one on the right is affected. That's what happens. Like this is normal over here.
What does the Horner syndrome, like, how does it affect us other than physically? Like, okay, one is constricted, one is dilated, but like, does it, for an example, affect us in a way we can't be able to see as clearly, or it's just nothing, physically, except like the way we look changes?
As far as I know, it's not very severe. There is obviously some problems with the vision. You'll cover it more next year in the neuro block because this is where it's mostly covered. There is some visual change, but it's on its own, it's like sort of benign. There's nothing wrong. Like there's nothing very severe. It's not like disability or something.
Since the sympathetic chain is cut, why does it only affect the vision? Because sympathetics affect almost like a lot of things in our body. So why are only our eyes affected? Does it depend on where it was like damaged or something?
Yep, good question. Yes, it does depend on where it's damaged. as it was mentioned, it was damage to the stellate ganglion. The stellate ganglion is mostly on the face. It controls sympathetics to the face. That's why it's only the face that's affected usually.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Can both happen on one eye? What do you mean both? Like, can it happen? Like Horner syndrome happens on both eyes? Like eyelids and pupil? Yeah, it happens only on one eye. Like this is compound. So if you notice over here, like take a look. Look at this pupil and look at this pupil. Which one is larger? Yeah, the one on the right here. This one's larger. This one, sorry, this one, the one on the right over here. My bad.
We have two paravertebral chains, right? So does this mean the one on the left is the one that's affected? And would the same happen if both of them were affected?
Sorry.
We have two paravertebral chains, right? So you see that his left eye is affected. Does that mean the left chain is affected? And what happens if both chains were affected?
What do we call it? It's only one chain in this case. If both chains, then you'll see the constriction on both eyes. This is what will happen. Can you give me a moment, please? I just need to let someone into the room. Sorry about that, guys. I'm back. Could you please repeat your question? Whoever asked, sorry, I wasn't with you. You mentioned the sympathetic chain on both sides, something like that.
Yeah, I got it. I was just asking about, like, we have a chain on the right and the left. So if the right one's affected, our right eye is going to be constricted.
Yep.
And vice versa.
Yep. There you go. So if both of them were affected, then you'll see constriction on both eyes. And if only one of them is affected, it's only one eye. Yep. Thanks. And that's pretty much it in terms of the lecture. I'm going to quickly go through the slides just to run through them, just to make sure I covered everything. And yeah, let me just stop sharing and go to the slides very quickly. Let's see. Let me share screen very quickly. All right, let's try to get through this quickly. So again, I'll see if we didn't cover anything. This is just a general introduction. Functions are homeostasis, whatever. We've covered all this. Basically, it's just a balance in the body. Oh, yeah, I'll tell you about the mistake right now in the slide. This is just the division over here. We mentioned all pre-cholinergic or acetylcholine, all acetylcholine norepinephrine. We covered all this. This is just what I've been discussing for a while. We mentioned that their location, the preganglionic is short on this one, long on this one, long on this one, short on this one. We already discussed this stuff. No need to go over it again unless someone asks. Again, these are functions. We discussed the functions: constrict the pupils, dilate the pupils, stimulate saliva, inhibit saliva, slow heart rate, increase heart rate, etc. You can go through them. You don't have to memorize them, by the way. Okay, so one last thing I want to discuss here is the varicosities over here. Yeah. Is the screen visible, guys? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So varicosities are just these.
No.
Sorry, I don't hear you. Okay. Varicosities are like these dilations over here. They have the neurotransmitters within them. They're like in the neuron itself. At the end of the neuron, there's this. Okay. And then finally, you can just see like after the neurotransmitters in the synapse, this is how it goes away. Like it might diffuse away. It might be metabolized by enzymes. It could be like retaken by the cell, or it can be degraded. So there are 4 things that could happen to the neurotransmitter after it's released. Remember when we talked about like the synapse thing, how it releases acetylcholine or norepinephrine? This acetylcholine needs to go away. It can either like diffuse, it goes away on its own like this, can be metabolized by enzymes. That means it's broken down. It can be actively transported into cells or recycled back into the cell, or it can be degraded by this specific enzyme, for example, monoamine oxidase. So this, like when it says metabolized by enzymes, this is the example over here. Again, this is just like how action potentials work. I think you guys covered it before. Action potential comes in, causes opening of the voltage gated calcium channel. This causes the, this vacuole of norepinephrine to be released into the synapse. And then it binds to the receptor. You can read it on your own. It's very straightforward. Again, this is the organization. I just forgot to mention that the paravertebral chain or the sympathetic chain is the same thing. So this is paravertebral. The reason it's called paravertebral is because it's parallel to the vertebra. So this is this is like the vertebra over here in the back, like the bones. This is the sympathetic chain, it's parallel to it. That's why it's called paravertebral. One very small thing is that some of the sympathetic chains to the GI specifically, like you see over here, the celiac, the superior mesenteric, and the inferior mesenteric, these don't go into the sympathetic chain. They go directly next to the organ. These are exceptions. Like remember how we mentioned in general, they're closer to they're further away from the organs. This is sort of the exception for that. This is just honestly just memorization in this case. And one last thing is that sweat glands for some reason use acetylcholine. I don't know why, but they just do. Instead of like using norepinephrine, they use acetylcholine. This is just a point of memorization. There's no understanding to be done here. Yeah, is there a question? Paravertebral is just the name of the sympathetic chain. So this is the sympathetic chain. It's known as paravertebral because it's parallel to the vertebra. So if this is like the vertebra over here, like see, these are the vertebral bones, the chain comes parallel to it. It means they run next to each other. That's why it's called paravertebral. And most of the sympathetic output goes into these. They go into the sympathetic chain.
So basically, paravertebral ganglia, basically they go to the sympathetic ganglia and they basically make a synapse with them. And the perivertebral ganglia, they skip they skip basically the chain and they just go to the organ, right?
The paravertebral is the same as the sympathetic chain. It's the same, like almost the same. It's almost the same. Like it's just paravertebral. I mean, it's parallel to the vertebra. The prevertebral is the one that skips it. Yeah, it's the one that skips.
And for the all right.
The mistake. Yeah. Okay. The mistake I'll cover in a bit. Sorry. What did you say? I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's okay. I was saying the paravertebral ganglia. Basically, it's another word for sympathetic chain, right?
Yeah. And then the prevertebral is the ones that get skipped by the sympathetic. This is all sympathetic, by the way. This is all sympathetic. So the sweat gland, it's not a mistake here. It's correct. Sweat glands do use acetylcholine for some reason. I don't know why. It's just how they are. They use acetylcholine instead of norepinephrine. You know how we mentioned norepinephrine is released in every organ by the postganglionic neuron? It's just that sweat glands use acetylcholine. Just a point of memorization, that's all. Okay, I'll point out the mistake in just a second. It's on the parasympathetic portion. This is the adrenal medulla. Yeah, sorry.
How would they ask us on the sweat gland point? Like, would they ask, are sweat glands controlled? Are they under parasympathetic or are they under sympathetic? Like,
they're under sympathetic, but the postganglionic neuron, instead of releasing norepinephrine, they released acetylcholine. It's not norepinephrine, it's acetylcholine.
Okay.
It's not cholinergic. It's still sympathetic, but it just does it through acetylcholine for some reason. There's no explanation to this. It's just your body having you memorize more things that are unnecessary. But it's just a thing. Okay. So the adrenal medulla, we already discussed all of this. There's not much different over here. Over here, he discusses pheochromocytoma. Pheochromocytoma, I don't think you need to know this, but all it does is that it is a tumor. It's a tumor that releases epinephrine. So imagine yourself always stressed out, like always in fight or flight response, always anxious. This is what like pheochromocytoma feels like. Hypertension, fast heart rate, tachycardia is fast heart rate, diaphoresis is sweating. So you're always sweating, always hypertensive, always heart rate is up. This is just a tumor. You don't have to know this probably. I don't know why he included this, but it's a tumor of the adrenal medulla. That's it. These are the receptors. We mentioned alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3, which was discussed down here. So as we mentioned, alpha 1 is mostly for smooth muscle, mostly vascular. Vascular meaning blood vessels. You can also find it in the GI, in the sphincters, in the radial muscles of the eye, all of that, but mostly in blood vessels. Anything with a smooth muscle, like just a general rule of thumb, anything with a smooth muscle is generally through the alpha 1 receptor. And most of these are through blood vessels, mostly. But there are other things like the GI, the bladder, and the eye over here. You don't need to know them specifically. But what you need to know is that it does it through the phospholipase C, calcium, IP3, if you remember that. It's not through cyclic AMP. It's not through that. It's through the other pathway. Alpha 2, as we mentioned, are inhibitory and produce relaxation. We said they are on nerve terminals, presynaptic nerve terminals. They're also found here, but like these are very minor. You don't need to know them. But just know that they're found on presynaptic terminals over here. And beta 1 receptors, as we mentioned, they're mostly on the heart. Beta 2, mostly on the lungs, bronchioles. And beta 3 are on adipocyte or adipose tissue for lipolysis. We already discussed this.
I just want to like remember something. You said something about CAMP or CAMP. Basically, beta 1, 2, and 3, they use these, right? The same way, like,
they just use it.
The same way in alpha 1, we have IP3 and CA2.
Yeah, it's just a point. It's not mentioned in the slides, but actually it is right here. So they all increase cyclic AMP, cyclic AMP.
Why does it say alpha 2 uses CAMP?
It decreases CAMP. So it's, if you know the receptor, do you know the G proteins? You know the subtype that's called GI?
No.
Okay, so you don't really, if you haven't taken it, you don't really need to know it. But basically, this does the opposite of like increasing cyclic AMP. So these increase cyclic AMP because these are inhibitory. It decreases cyclic AMP. That's all.
But I thought the alpha receptors they go by the IP3 and calcium pathway.
Yeah, alpha 1. Alpha 1 goes by the IP3 calcium pathway. This one goes by decreasing cyclic AMP because it is inhibitory. That's why. I forgot to mention it earlier when we were discussing it. But alpha 2 is different from alpha 1. Oh. Remember how we mentioned it was in the neuron before to like as a brake? It acts like a brake. Remember that? So basically, all it does is decrease cyclic AMP. You don't really need to know this, but it's just mentioned there. Just remember, alpha 2 decreases cyclic AMP. That's all you need to remember. And then all the betas are with increased cyclic AMP, increased cyclic AMP, increased cyclic AMP, increased cyclic AMP. And alpha 1 is through the calcium pathway. There's no rule to it. It's just how the receptor works.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Okay, so this is the small mistake in the slide. This is cranial nerve number 9. This is not the hypoglossal.
One more question. Beta 2 receptors, they're inhibitory?
Beta 2 receptors are stimulatory. So here it says inhibitory. It's kind of confusing. but all they do is that they increase cyclic AMP, and that somehow causes the relaxation of a smooth muscle. But they do increase cyclic AMP by relaxing the smooth muscle in the airway. It's just their function, but generally they increase cyclic AMP. The receptors work differently. It's a bit confusing. I know it's like it says inhibitory over here. This one says inhibitory. This one says excitatory. This one says excitatory. It's just the way they work initially through cyclic AMP is the same. The way this cyclic AMP goes into the cell is inhibitory.
So it's only the B2 that has the cyclic AMP causing an inhibitory effect.
Yeah, inhibitory on smooth muscle. On smooth muscle.
Of the airways?
Yeah, the airways. Because you need to open up the airways.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. And as we said, beta 3 is for fat to release energy. I just want to quickly point out the mistake over here. This is cranial nerve number 9. It's not very significant. This is not the hypoglossal nerve. It is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Glossopharyngeal. Just a small mistake. You can maybe tell Dr. Abdul Jabbar about it. It's not very significant. You don't need to know this stuff, but it's just a small little mistake. Other than that, we mentioned that it was 3 cranial nerves, so the parasympathetic. We said it was 3, 7, 9, and 10. And then obviously S2 to S4 over here. And this is just the organization of it. We already discussed all of these. And then we mentioned that the vagus nerve is 75% of all sympathetic fibers. Last thing is just the function over here. You can go over this on your own. So in the sympathetic, it causes increased heart rate through beta 1 receptors. The parasympathetic causes decreased heart rate through the muscarinic receptors over here. So they do almost the exact opposite thing. On vascular smooth muscle, we mentioned alpha 1. Alpha 1 causes constriction of blood vessels. Now, I forgot your name. Whoever asked me the question about inhibitory, if you notice over here, this is beta 2 again, right? You see how it says dilate blood vessel? It's causing relaxation. So it's inhibitory again to the smooth muscle.
Okay.
So it's also in the blood vessels and the airway, but it's specifically just in skeletal muscle. But I don't think you need to know that detail. It's very detailed there. In general, whatever sympathetic does, just the main idea, whatever sympathetic does, parasympathetic does the opposite through muscarinic receptors. If you notice over here, sweat glands, for sweating, it's through the muscarinic cholinergic receptor for sympathetic. In the parasympathetic, there's no such thing as like reverse sweating. So there's no like action through the parasympathetic. It's not innervated that way because you can't unsweat. You just can sweat. That's why. And then the rest are not very important down here. This is just an example. I don't think you need to know the specifics. Just remember the SA node is the pacemaker. When you cause increased sympathetic activity on the SA node, it increases the heart rate, as we mentioned earlier. The parasympathetic causes decrease. So you'll take this in CVP. You don't need to cover right now the SA node and the AV node and all that. This is just what makes the heart rate. This is what makes heart rate. What makes heart rate? When you slow it down, it causes decreased heart rate. When you speed it up, it causes increased heart rate. That's all. This is just an example. You don't need to know much about it. And this is the same thing, by the way, from earlier. It's just telling you the mechanism in which heart rate slows down. You don't really need to know this. It's just that through muscarinic receptors over here, all it does is decrease heart rate. Through the sympathetic pathway, it causes, through its beta 1 receptors, it causes increased heart rate. We've discussed this. So remember, sympathetic, increased heart rate. Parasympathetic, parasympathetic is decreased heart rate. And this is for the blood pressure. You don't really need to know this, in my opinion. This is just telling you how sympathetic decreases the how decreased sympathetic output, increased sympathetic output. You can trace the map if you want, but it's just basically talking about blood pressure. You'll cover this more in CVP. This will be covered more in CVP. You could read through it. If Dr. Abdul Jabbar covered this extensively, if he just glossed over it, you don't have to cover it. If he did cover it, just follow the transcript in that case, because it's very advanced right now. This is Horner syndrome. Again, this is the constricted pupil over here. There's the eyelid over here. If you notice, this is open over here, much more open, dilated. This is because of damage to the stellate ganglion or the sympathetic nerve trunk, which is this over here. It could be over here or it could be over here, depending on the location, and they both do the exact same thing. And did Dr. Abdul Jabbar cover this? Just a quick question. Was this covered in the lecture? Well, was this just a diagram at the end just to show you? Because this is like advanced, this is like a bunch of drug names over here. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if the doctor covered it. If he did, I'll cover it. If he didn't, then I'll skip it as well. Basically, all this means. How did he go? Did he cover the drugs, or did he just tell you that, like, the mechanisms of drugs cause for sympathetic nerve endings? Yeah, okay. So basically, some drugs act like norepinephrine, some drugs act like this, some drugs act on these receptors, etc., etc. Basically, these are targets for the drugs. I'm not sure how he covered it though. Yeah, okay. So basically, you can just bind to the receptor over here. It's the same thing we discussed earlier. It just has to do with the receptors. So release of it could cause release of neurotransmitters. It could act through alpha-2 over here. We mentioned norepinephrine over here can bind down here to the receptor. It can go back over here, etc. This is the same thing we covered earlier. And this is just a question. I don't know why he included this, but all you need to know is, like, it's anti-cholinergic. Cholinergic meaning has to do with the parasympathetic, all that. What parasympathetic, when you decrease it, if you know, the parasympathetic nervous system causes salivation because it's for digestion. When you have decreased salivation, you have a dry mouth, and that's why it's here. All the rest are for, what do we call it? Are for other effects. So yeah, that's about all. I don't think he'll put this question in the exam, by the way. This is just like a fun fact. Are there any questions? Anything you guys want me to cover again? Any questions? Any concerns? All right. Sounds good. You're welcome.